In the shadowed corners of a heart betrayal carves its mark, not with a blade, but with silence, a weapon so subtle it can unravel a soul before it even notices the wound. Major General Evelyn Maddox stood at the edge of her pass, clutching an invitation that felt less like a summons and more like a gauntlet thrown at her feet. The gold-embossed letters spelled her name with clinical precision, a title stripped of warmth as if her family had reduced her to a rank to distance themselves from the daughter they once held. 6 years of silence, 6 years of unanswered birthdays of voicemails that echoed with absence had built a wall between Evelyn and the home she once knew. Yet here, in the crisp Virginia air, she stood her uniform a defiant armor against the curated perfection of cherry blossoms and manicured hedges. The house, unchanged since her father's funeral, loomed like a museum of her erasure, every polished surface reflecting a family that had chosen to forget her. Psychologically, betrayal by those closest cuts deepest because it shatters the primal trust woven into familial bonds. Evelyn's story is not unique. It is archetypal, a narrative etched into the human condition where love is expected to be unconditional, but is often conditional on conformity. Her parents, Barbara and the late General Maddox, had crafted a narrative of Evelyn as the outlier, the loud one, the one who dared to rise too high, too visibly. This is the paradox of family. It is both sanctuary and battleground, where the expectation of loyalty can become a cage. Evelyn's absence from their lives was not an accident, but a deliberate act, a silent campaign to dim her light so that her sister Haley could shine unthreatened. The invitation with its single-word note "behave" was not a bridge, but a stage direction, a script for Evelyn to play the role of the penitent the outsider allowed to return, only to validate their narrative of her disgrace. You standing at the edge of your own story, have you felt this? The sting of being invited not for who you are, but for what you can prove to others. The weight of a room that knows your name, but not your heart. Evelyn's presence at the wedding rehearsal dinner was a calculated risk, a step into a space where every glance, every seat was a reminder of her exile. The table set for 15 placed her at the far end next to the sideboard where the heat from the kitchen would keep her uncomfortable, a subtle but deliberate slight. This is the architecture of rejection. It is not loud, not overt, but meticulous, designed to make you question your worth without ever raising a voice. The whispers of security from a cousin, the absence of her name on the seating chart, the off-shade napkin at her place. These were not oversights, but messages, each one a brick in the wall her family had built to keep her out. Yet Evelyn's response was not anger, but a quiet, searing presence. When Haley's toast mocked her as the sister who guards doors and Barbara's sharp words labeled her the family's shame, the laughter that followed was a collective attempt to diminish her. Laughter in such moments is a social blade cutting the target out of the circle. Psychologically, this is ostracism's cruel efficiency. It isolates without confrontation, leaving the victim to bear the weight of their own exclusion. But Evelyn's silence, her untouched glass raised in a calm sip, was a reclamation of power. Her words, "The people I guard outrank everyone in this room," were not a retort, but a revelation, a statement of self that refused to be erased. And when Andrew, her sister's fiancé, saluted her, his act was a crack in the family's narrative, a moment where truth broke through the performance. This is the turning point of betrayal's arc, the moment when the betrayed chooses not to mirror the cruelty, but to transcend it. Evelyn's story resonates because it mirrors the universal struggle to be seen, not as others wish you to be, but as you are. You who have walked into rooms where your presence was tolerated but not welcomed know this ache. You understand the courage it takes to stand, not to shout, but to simply be unwavering until the world adjusts to your existence. Evelyn's journey is not about revenge, but recognition, a refusal to let silence define her worth. As she stood in that ballroom under the weight of salutes from those who saw her truth, she began to rewrite the script, not for her family, but for herself. The ballroom's silence lingered, a fragile pause where truth hung like dust motes in a shaft of light. Evelyn Maddox stood her uniform crisp, her presence a quiet rebellion against the family that had sculpted her absence with surgical precision. The salutes from Colonel Reardon, General Park, and the older woman with eyes that carried the weight of her own stars had shifted the room's gravity. No longer was Evelyn the shadow at the sideboard. She was the center not by force, but by the sheer weight of her existence. The gasps, the shattered champagne flute, Haley's dramatic collapse. These were not the climax, but the aftermath, the ripples of a truth too long buried. Betrayal's wound is not just in the act, but in the expectation that the betrayed will accept it quietly, will fold themselves into the narrative of their own erasure. Evelyn refused. Psychologically, this moment is a pivot point where the betrayed reclaims agency not through confrontation, but through presence. The human psyche craves belonging. Yet when family, the supposed bedrock of identity, becomes the source of rejection, it forces a reckoning. Evelyn's family had not merely ignored her. They had crafted a narrative where her success was a threat, her rank a blemish on their curated perfection. Barbara's pearl-buttoned composure, Haley's calculated charm, these were tools of control designed to keep Evelyn small. Yet control when rooted in fear is fragile. Andrew's salute, crisp and deliberate, was not just a gesture of respect, but a public dismantling of the family's script. It exposed the lie Evelyn was not the shame, their treatment of her was. This is the archetype of the outcast who returns not to beg for acceptance, but to demand visibility. Her silence, louder than their laughter, was a mirror held up to their cruelty. You know this mirror, don't you? The one you've held up in moments when you refused to let others define your worth, when you stood trembling, perhaps, but unyielding in a room that wanted you invisible. Evelyn's story is yours, when you face the ache of being unseen by those who should have loved you most. The psychology of such moments is raw. The brain wired for connection recoils at rejection, yet it also learns resilience. Evelyn's calm sip of champagne, her measured words, were not acts of defiance, but of self-preservation, a declaration that she would not let their silence hollow her out. The salutes that followed were not just for her rank, but for her refusal to vanish, a recognition that resonates with anyone who has ever fought to be seen. In the hotel lounge hours later, the air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Barbara sat across from Evelyn, her cardigan, a pale shield, her coffee cold as the distance between them. Her request for a statement, a neutral bandage to cover the family's exposed wounds, was a final attempt to rewrite the narrative, to smooth over the cracks Evelyn had forced into the open. Betrayal, when systemic, often cloaks itself in practicality, in pleas for understanding, as if the betrayer's discomfort outweighs the betrayed's pain. Barbara's words, "We didn't mean to hurt, you were a hollow echo of accountability," a refusal to name the choices that had carved Evelyn out of their lives. The document Evelyn slid across the table with its damning linguistic analysis was not revenge, but evidence, a ledger of sabotage that bore Barbara's and Haley's fingerprints. The 96% match was not just data. It was a map of betrayal, charting how a mother and sister had conspired to dim a star they could not bear to see shine. This is the cruelty of familial betrayal. It is not always loud or overt, but meticulous, woven into whispers, omissions, and paperwork. Psychologically, it exploits the betrayed's hope, the lingering belief that love might still be salvaged. Evelyn's response, "You didn't just ignore me, mother, you sabotaged me," was a scalpel, cutting through that hope to expose the truth. Barbara's welled eyes, her trembling hand that never quite reached across the table, were not redemption, but recognition too late and too small. The archetype here is the betrayed child standing before the parent who failed them, not seeking forgiveness, but clarity. You felt this, haven't you? The moment when you realized love was not enough to bridge the gap, when you chose to protect yourself over pleasing them. Evelyn's refusal to issue a statement was not spite, but sovereignty, a choice, to let the truth stand unsoftened. As she walked away, leaving the documents on the table, Evelyn carried not anger, but a quiet resolve. The lounge's velvet chairs and dim lamps could not contain the weight of what had passed, a mother's failure, a daughter's reclamation. The world outside waited not with answers, but with the promise of a new script, one Evelyn would write herself. The Amalfi Coast stretched before Evelyn Maddox, its waves whispering secrets to the cliffs, each crest a reminder that some truths endure beyond the reach of human hands. Barefoot on a terrace carved into the rock, she held a cup of espresso, its bitterness grounding her in a moment, untainted by the expectations of others. the sea's vastness mirrored the expanse she had carved within herself, a space where silence no longer stung, but sang. Betrayal, when it comes from those who should have been your shelter, leaves a wound that reshapes the soul's architecture. Evelyn's wound was not fresh, but it had been deep, a chasm widened by years of her family's calculated absence. Yet here, in this quiet corner of the world, she stood not as a general or a daughter, but as a woman who had chosen to exist without apology. Psychologically, the aftermath of betrayal is a landscape of both ruin and renewal. The human mind, wired to seek connection, grapples with the paradox of loving those who have harmed it most. Evelyn's family had not merely turned away, they had orchestrated her erasure, from the anonymous tip that nearly derailed her career to the off-shade napkin at Haley's wedding. Such acts are not random, but deliberate, rooted in a fear of what the betrayed represents, a challenge to control, a mirror to their own inadequacies. Barbara's plea in the lounge, her attempt to rewrite the narrative with a press statement, was a final grasp at power, a refusal to face the shame of her own choices. Evelyn's silence in response was not passive but profound, a rejection of the role they had cast her in. This is the archetype of the outcast, who rises not to destroy, but to redefine, transforming betrayal's pain into a foundation for selfhood. Have you stood on this precipice? Felt the pull to return to those who hurt you, hoping for a reconciliation that never comes? The heart clings to the myth of family as a safe harbor, but Evelyn's journey reveals a harder truth. Sometimes safety must be built within. Her refusal to soften the truth for her mother's comfort was an act of liberation, a severing of the invisible threads that tied her worth to their approval. The viral clip from the wedding, 3 million views in 48 hours, was not her victory, but a byproduct, a public echo of a private truth. When she declined the Pentagon's offer of a chair position, she chose not power but purpose, launching the Resilience Foundation to guide others through the battles fought not on fields, but at dinner tables, in empty chairs, in the silences that cut deeper than words. The archetype of the betrayed is universal, yet its resolution is deeply personal. Evelyn's foundation was not just a resource, but a reclamation, a way to alchemize her pain into something that could hold others up. Psychologically, this is resilience, in its purest form, the ability to transform trauma into meaning, to build from the rubble of rejection a structure that stands taller than the one that fell. The service members she helped, those sabotaged by spouses, siblings, parents, were not just clients, but kin bound by the shared language of survival. Evelyn's story resonates because it speaks to the quiet courage of those who rebuild, not to prove others wrong, but to prove themselves right. You know this courage, don't you? The strength it takes to walk away from a table that never set a place for you, to choose your own path over the one they demanded you walk. The letter from Barbara, arriving months later, was handwritten, its words trembling with regret but laced with self-justification. I didn't realize how far you had climbed, she wrote, as if Evelyn's ascent was a surprise rather than a truth she had chosen to ignore. The letter was not an apology, but an admission, a crack in the facade of a woman who had built her life on control. Evelyn read it under the Amalfi sun, the sea's rhythm steadying her pulse. She did not reply, not out of anger, but because the letter was not for her, it was for Barbara, a way to ease her own guilt. This is the final layer of betrayal psychology, the betrayer's need to rewrite the past, to claim they never saw the harm they caused. Evelyn's choice to let the letter sit unanswered was a boundary, a declaration that her peace no longer depended on their acknowledgement. As the village boy ran off, his laughter mingling with the sea's song, Evelyn felt the weight of her stars lift, not because they were gone, but because they no longer defined her. The silence that once punished her now cradled her, a space where she could exist without proving herself to anyone. This is the heart of her story, not the betrayal, not the salutes, but the quiet act of choosing herself, of standing barefoot on a terrace and knowing that her worth was not tied to those who failed to see it. The Amalfi sun dipped low, painting the sea in hues of amber and indigo as Evelyn Maddox stood on her terrace, the salt breeze weaving through her unbound hair. The world felt vast, yet intimate, a canvas where her existence was no longer a footnote in someone else's story. Betrayal's legacy is not just the scar it leaves, but the space it clears for rebirth, a paradox where loss becomes the soil for growth. Evelyn's journey had carried her from the suffocating precision of Virginia's cul-de-sacs to this cliffside haven where the rhythm of waves replaced the staccato of expectations. Her family's rejection, Barbara's cold efficiency, Haley's calculated charm had once threatened to hollow her, but now in this moment of stillness, she was whole. Not because they had relented, but because she had released them. Psychologically, the act of letting go is a radical defiance of betrayal's grip. The human heart, tethered to its earliest bonds, often clings to the hope of reconciliation, even when the evidence points to futility. Evelyn's family had not merely distanced her, they had weaponized their silence, crafting a narrative where her strength was a liability, her rank a stain. The anonymous tip to the ethics board, the off-shade napkin, the laughter at Haley's toast. These were not isolated acts, but a campaign to erase her. Yet erasure, when met with resilience, becomes a catalyst. Evelyn's Resilience Foundation was more than a lifeline for others. It was her reclamation of agency, a refusal to let her pain remain a private wound. By helping service members rebuild from betrayal by spouses, siblings, parents, she transformed her isolation into a shared sanctuary, a place where the unseen could be seen. You've felt this, haven't you? The moment when you realize that healing doesn't require their apology, only your permission to move forward. The psyche bruised by rejection learns to forge new connections, not with those who failed it, but with those who understand its worth. Evelyn's work was a testament to this alchemy, turning the lead of betrayal into the gold of purpose. The service members who came to her carrying stories of sabotaged careers, of families who turned away, were not just clients, but mirrors reflecting the strength she had cultivated in her own exile. This is the archetype of the wounded healer whose scars become maps for others, guiding them through the terrain of loss to a place of renewal. Her foundation was not about fixing what was broken, but about building anew a structure rooted in the truth of who she was, not who her family wished her to be. The letter from Barbara, now tucked away in a drawer, was a relic of a past Evelyn no longer needed to carry. Its words, "I wish I had seen you then," were less an olive branch than a confession, an attempt to ease a guilt that was not Evelyn's to bear. Psychologically, such gestures from betrayers are often less about the betrayed and more about their own need for absolution. Barbara's regret was real, but it was also self-serving, a way to soften the mirror Evelyn had held up in that ballroom. By choosing not to respond, Evelyn drew a line, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. This is the quiet power of boundaries. They protect not by shutting others out, but by safeguarding the space where you can thrive. You know this space, don't you? The one you've carved out when you stopped waiting for their approval, when you chose to live for yourself instead of their expectations. In the village below, life moved in its unhurried rhythm, children laughing, vendors calling the clink of glasses at a nearby cafe. The boy who had asked if she was a general returned with another basket, his grin a reminder that the world could still hold innocence. Evelyn's smile in return was not just for him, but for the woman she had become, one who no longer needed stars on her shoulders to prove her worth. The viral clip, the salutes, the headlines, they were echoes of a moment, not the moment itself. The true victory was here in the quiet of a terrace where she could breathe without proving herself, where the sea's endless song reminded her that some things endure beyond betrayal's reach. This is the heart of Evelyn's story, and perhaps yours, the courage to stand in your own truth, to let go of those who could not hold you, and to find peace in the silence you once feared. As the sun sank into the sea, Evelyn turned from the horizon, her espresso cup empty, but her heart full. She was no longer the daughter erased, the general saluted, or the sister mocked. She was simply herself, and that was enough. In the stillness, she found freedom, a rebirth born not from their recognition, but from her own unyielding choice to exist. The sea whispered on, and Evelyn at last was home.